I just moved into my dream home by the lake, and before I even unpacked, the HOA stormed in. They were demanding I give up part of the lake, right in front of me. I couldn't believe it, strangers telling me I had no right to my own property. But what they didn't know was that I controlled their docks. And the moment I revealed it, everything they thought they owned, everything they were so confident about, came crashing down. You won't believe their reaction, and how this little-known secret turned the tables in seconds. Stay with me, this story gets wilder with every minute. I remember the day I moved into my lake house like it was yesterday. It was early morning, the sky still a pale gray, and the mist rising off the lake gave everything a kind of magic glow. I had dreamed about this house for years, my own place right on the water, surrounded by trees, with that quiet calm you only get when no one is around. It felt perfect. The kind of place where you could breathe and finally feel free. The moving trucks arrived, and I was buzzing with excitement. Every box carried a little piece of my life, and as I carried them inside, I imagined myself waking up to the water every morning. I set up the living room first, then the kitchen. The lake was just steps away, and I could see the sunlight glinting off the surface. It felt unreal. I was finally here. But then, around mid-morning, I noticed a small white van parked across the street. There were a few people stepping out, clipboards in hand, and the instant I saw them, my stomach sank. The letters on the side of the van made it clear. HO. Homeowners Association. I had dealt with them in passing before, but never this close. And the look in their eyes. It was a mix of authority and judgment. Before I had even fully unpacked, they were at my door. They introduced themselves with wide smiles that didn't reach their eyes and started rattling off rules. "You're encroaching on the lake property," one of them said. "Your dock is too close to the boundary. You need to remove it immediately." I blinked. I had been so careful. Every measurement, every permit. I had done everything by the book. "I'm sorry," I said cautiously. "I've checked the property lines, and this dock is within my boundary." They ignored me. One woman, clearly the leader, flipped through a folder. "These rules are non-negotiable," she said. "We're giving you 24 hours to comply or face fines." I felt a flush of panic. My heart was racing, and I could see the sweat starting at the back of my neck. But I kept my voice calm. "I understand, but I have documentation proving this dock is mine." They scoffed. "Documentation? We've seen plenty of so-called documents. This is an established community, and we enforce the rules." I realized immediately that this wasn't going to be simple. These people weren't just concerned about the rules, they were territorial. They wanted control. And somehow, I was in their way. Over the next hour, they walked around the dock, took pictures, measured distances, and whispered among themselves. I stood quietly, watching, feeling a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. All of a sudden, what was supposed to be a peaceful first day in my new home had turned into a tense showdown. As they finally left, I went inside and sat on my porch. I looked at the lake and felt both despair and determination. I had worked too hard for this place to be bullied by a group of people hiding behind rules and threats. And then it hit me, while they thought they controlled everything, I had something they didn't know. Something that could change everything. The paperwork for the docks was in my office, but more than that, I knew the layout of the property, the easements, and the legal rights that came with it. The HOA had no idea that this little dock I had spent months planning and building wasn't just mine. It gave me control over their access to the water. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept going back to the confrontation, replaying every word, every smirk. How dare they storm into my life like they owned the place? The more I thought about it, the more a fire built inside me. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, I got up early and walked down to the dock. I ran my hands along the wooden boards, checking the integrity of the supports. I felt a strange mix of pride and vindication. This dock wasn't just wood and nails, it was power. The HOA didn't realize it, but they were standing on ground that could completely change their leverage. Later that day, more members of the HOA arrived. This time, it was a bigger group. They came with the same attitude, but now I was ready. I stayed calm, let them talk, let them accuse, let them make their threats. And then, when the moment was right, I started mentioning the easements, the dock permits, and the exact legal boundaries. I could see their expressions change from confidence to confusion. By the end of the day, I realized something important. Fear could be turned into control. And for the first time, I understood that this fight wasn't just about a dock or a lake, it was about respect, authority, and standing up for yourself when everyone expects you to back down. That first encounter set the tone for everything that was about to happen. The HOA thought they were in charge. They had no idea that the tables were about to turn. The next morning, I woke up to an uneasy silence. The lake shimmered under the early sunlight, but the calm was deceptive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't done. In fact, I knew they weren't. People like that, territorial, power-hungry, don't just back off because you politely prove them wrong. No, they escalate. And that's exactly what happened. Around 9 o'clock, I saw them gathering across the street. Not just the small group from yesterday, this time, it was nearly a dozen people. Clipboards, cameras, measuring tapes, all ready for action. My stomach tightened. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Could this really turn into a full-blown standoff? I knew I had to remain calm, or at least look calm, because if they sensed hesitation, they'd try to push me off my property. When they finally made their way up my driveway, their leader, an older woman with sharp eyes and a perfectly pressed blazer, spoke first. Her tone was colder this time, almost hostile. "We gave you a chance yesterday," she said, "but it's clear you're not taking this seriously. That dock has to be removed immediately. This is non-negotiable." I took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to smile. "I understand your concerns," I said evenly, "but as I explained yesterday, the dock is entirely within my property. I have all the permits and legal documentation." She rolled her eyes. "Permits? We don't care about permits. This is about community rules. You're setting a dangerous precedent. If we let this slide, every homeowner is going to think they can ignore the HOA." I felt a flicker of anger. Dangerous precedent? I was not a criminal. I was not breaking the law. "Respectfully," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm following every rule I'm required to follow. And as far as the community goes, this dock has no impact on anyone. You can't enforce something that's legally mine." A younger man in the group stepped forward. He was the type who liked to show off knowledge he didn't actually have. "We're just here to make sure everyone follows the rules," he said, "and right now, you're clearly in violation." I let out a slow breath. They clearly thought they had me cornered. But I had done my homework. I knew the rules inside out. And more importantly, I knew their weak spots, their overreach, their assumptions, and the fact that they didn't know the legal easement that gave me full control over access to the docks. For the next 20 minutes, they circled the dock, measuring distances, snapping photos, and muttering to each other. I stayed quiet, pretending to be nervous while actually planning my move. I wanted them to believe they had the upper hand. The tension was almost unbearable. I could feel every second stretching out like an eternity. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the men leaned over the dock railing and made a snide comment. "You're lucky this is a small lake. If it were bigger, this would have been a huge problem." I stepped closer. My voice calm but firm, I said, "Actually, this isn't a problem for anyone, because legally, I control the docks you're standing on." The group froze. I could see the confusion spreading across their faces. "What do you mean?" the leader asked sharply. I smiled slightly, trying to keep my tone casual while letting the tension build. "These docks are not just mine to use, they fall under an easement I legally own. Every foot you're standing on is technically under my control. You might have thought you had the right to police this, but in reality, you don't." There was a moment of stunned silence. They exchanged glances, whispering to each other. You could see the shift in their body language, the arrogance draining, replaced with uncertainty. The leader finally spoke, but her voice was quieter, less certain. "Are you saying we can't enforce the rules here?" I nodded. "Exactly. You assumed authority over something you have no legal claim to. And now, you're on the wrong side of this. I recommend leaving before this escalates further." For a few seconds, no one moved. The air was thick with tension. Then the younger man spoke up, trying to salvage their authority. We need to review this." I took a step back and gestured toward the dock. "Take all the time you need. But remember, while you're questioning my claim, you're standing on property that's technically mine. Every decision you make here should be carefully considered." It was surreal. I had imagined this moment so many times, but seeing the shock on their faces, the subtle panic creeping into their expressions, made it feel almost cinematic. They had stormed into my life thinking they were in control. But now, for the first time, they weren't. They eventually left, but not before giving me cold, measured glares. I knew this wasn't over. People like that don't just walk away quietly. They regroup, strategize, and try again. I could feel the tension in the air long after their van drove off. After they left, I walked down to the dock alone. The sun was shining on the water, and the lake looked calm again, almost peaceful. I ran my hand along the wood and felt a sense of quiet triumph. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't shouted, hadn't lost control, but I had made my point. I was not someone to be pushed around. That evening, I sat inside and went over the legal documents once more. I double-checked every line, every clause. I wanted to be prepared. Because I knew they'd come back. And next time, I wouldn't just show them paperwork, I'd make them understand, in a way they couldn't ignore. I also realized something else that night. This wasn't just about property. This was about respect. About standing your ground when people try to intimidate you. About showing that just because someone thinks they have authority, it doesn't mean they're right. By the time the sun set over the lake, casting golden light across the water, I felt ready. The HOA thought they had power. They thought they were in charge. But I had the advantage now, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. The confrontation had escalated, emotions were high, and the stakes were clear. This wasn't going to be a quiet fight. It was personal now, and I was fully aware that the next encounter would be decisive. I went to bed that night with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, planning for every possible move. The HOA had underestimated me. Big mistake. The next morning, I woke with a sense of both anticipation and dread. I knew the HOA wasn't going to back down. They had made it clear yesterday that they expected compliance, and the fact that I stood my ground had already thrown them off balance. But now, it was time to take things a step further. I wasn't going to argue with them endlessly. I had the proof, I had the authority, and it was time they realized it. I spent the morning reviewing all the paperwork, property deeds, easement agreements, and dock permits. Every document clearly showed that the land surrounding the lake, including the docks, was under my control. They had no legal ground to stand on. More importantly, they had assumed power they simply didn't have. They didn't know, and they would soon find out. By late morning, I could see them arriving again. This time, it was almost a dozen people, their confidence slightly shaken but still apparent. They carried clipboards, cameras, and an air of determination. I greeted them with a calm smile, masking the mix of nerves and excitement I felt inside. The leader, the woman in the blazer, stepped forward immediately. Her tone was sharper than ever. "We're here because you have refused to comply. This dock has to be removed today. You will not set a precedent for the neighborhood." I took a slow breath, then gestured toward the dock. "I understand your concern, but I think it's time you understand the full situation." They looked confused. "What do you mean?" one of the men asked. I walked down the path toward the dock, keeping my tone calm but deliberate. "This dock isn't just a structure on my property. It falls under an easement I legally control. Every foot of it, every area you assumed you had authority over, it's mine. You don't have the right to dictate what happens here. I could see the disbelief on their faces. Some of them whispered to each other. Others froze, staring at me as if trying to comprehend what I just said. The leader stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Are you saying that we don't have any authority over this dock? I nodded. Exactly. And more than that, by standing here, you're technically on property I control. You assumed authority you don't have, and now it's clear that the tables have turned. There was a long silence. You could feel the tension in the air like static electricity. I continued walking along the dock, holding the property documents in my hand. Let me show you, I said. I handed a copy of the easement and permits to the nearest member. Their fingers shook slightly as they held the pages. The woman leader snatched the papers, scanning quickly. I could see the color drain from her face. Her confident demeanor faltered as she muttered, This can't be right. I smiled faintly, trying not to appear smug. It's right. And this proves that while you thought you were in control, you were completely mistaken. I suggest you reconsider your approach before escalating things further. One of the younger members muttered, We need to verify this. But the leader waved him off, her face tight with frustration. I've double-checked, I said firmly. Every clause, every boundary, every regulation. You assumed authority over something that has always been under my control. You made threats, demanded compliance, and came onto my property thinking you were in charge. And now, you see the truth. The shock was palpable. For the first time, they didn't have an answer. Their confident postures were gone, replaced with tension and embarrassment. Some crossed their arms, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered furiously to each other, clearly trying to figure out how to respond. I kept walking along the dock, pointing out specific markers on the property, showing them the official signs of my easement rights. Every step emphasized my control. Every word made it clear that the tables had turned completely. Finally, the leader spoke again, her voice tight and measured. You have legal documentation? I nodded. I do. And not just the paperwork, you also don't have the authority you assumed. That's the key point. I suggest you leave and reconsider your approach. Continuing to challenge me could have consequences you didn't anticipate. At this point, the entire group was visibly shaken. They had come here expecting to intimidate me, to force compliance. Instead, they were confronted with the fact that they had overstepped, that they were in the wrong, and that I had the upper hand. I could see their frustration, their attempts to maintain control failing in real time. They glanced at each other, unsure how to respond. They had been so sure of their power yesterday. And now, that certainty was gone. I took a deep breath and let the moment linger. Sometimes, it's not enough to just prove a point, you have to let the other side fully realize it. And that realization was visible on their faces. Shock, disbelief, and a dawning understanding that they had misjudged the situation completely. Finally, the leader handed the paperwork back to me, her hands slightly trembling. We will need to review this, she said, voice tight. I nodded calmly. Take all the time you need. Just remember, the property and the docks are mine, and any further attempts to enforce rules here without legal authority could result in consequences. They left after a few tense minutes, giving me cold, measured looks. But this time, it was different. They were no longer the aggressors, they were the ones on edge. The victory wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was undeniable. I had maintained control without raising my voice or losing my composure. After they left, I stood on the dock, looking out at the calm water. The lake reflected the sunlight like a mirror, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph. I had faced intimidation, stress, and threats, and I had come out on top. That evening, I sat inside and reflected on what had happened. The confrontation had escalated from a simple misunderstanding to a full-blown clash of authority. I realized that knowledge, preparation, and calm confidence were far more powerful than anger or aggression. I hadn't just defended my property, I had exposed the HOA's assumptions and their lack of understanding about what they were really dealing with. By the time the sun set, painting the lake with shades of gold and orange, I felt a sense of justice. Not the kind delivered by courts or fines, but the kind that comes from standing up for yourself, knowing your rights, and turning the tables on those who underestimated you. This was the turning point. From this moment on, the HOA knew that I was not someone to be pushed around. They had tried to assert power over me, and they had failed. The revelation of my control over the docks had shifted the balance completely, and I could finally breathe a little easier, knowing I had won the first round in this battle. After the shocking revelation on the dock, I thought the worst of it was over. I imagined the HOA would retreat quietly, rethinking their aggressive approach. Maybe they'd begrudgingly accept that they had misjudged me. But I quickly realized that people like that don't just vanish when they lose an argument. They regroup. They strategize. They plan their next move. The day after the confrontation, I woke to a subtle but unmistakable tension in the neighborhood. I noticed cars parked a little too close to my driveway, neighbors glancing at me with something between curiosity and judgment. The HOA members themselves hadn't made a scene yet, but I knew they were watching. I could feel their eyes like weight pressing from across the street. It was strange, that feeling, part relief, part anxiety. Relief because I had the upper hand and had successfully exposed their lack of authority. Anxiety because I had no idea what they were planning next. I spent the morning walking along the lake, letting the water calm me, but my mind kept circling back to the confrontation. Their faces, the disbelief, the whispered exchanges, I could still see it all clearly. By mid-morning, the HOA sent another notice. This one was longer, more formal, typed and printed in bold letters. They cited community concerns and potential hazards around the dock. I read it carefully, line by line, noting the subtle language changes. They weren't outright threatening me anymore. They were trying to find a loophole, something they could use to regain control without directly challenging me. I smiled quietly to myself. They were trying to play a game, but they didn't understand the rules fully. They assumed I would back down, that I'd be intimidated by their notices and their authority. But that assumption was completely wrong. Over the next few days, there were more visits. Smaller groups, more subtle, lingering questions about property lines, clarifications on easements, and comments about the docks. Every time they came, I remained calm, polite, and firm. I answered questions with confidence, showed documents when necessary, and kept the emotional upper hand. Each interaction reminded me how powerful composure and preparation could be. One afternoon, I noticed something interesting. The HOA members were now consulting each other more often, speaking in hushed tones, and clearly second-guessing themselves. Their earlier swagger had faded. They were no longer storming in like they owned the place. They were cautious, almost nervous, as if unsure how to proceed. It was in that moment I realized the true impact of the dock revelation. It wasn't just a one-time victory. It had shifted the entire dynamic. The HOA had assumed dominance over everyone in the neighborhood. They had thought that their rules and authority would always go unchallenged. But now, I had shown that even in a small community, knowledge, preparation, and courage could level the playing field. Even neighbors started noticing the tension. A few of them came over, curious about the situation. I explained, without gloating, that there had been a misunderstanding, and that the docks were fully within my legal rights. Some nodded, others shook their heads, clearly impressed. It was satisfying to see that the truth was spreading quietly. Word travels fast in small neighborhoods, and the HOA's image of absolute authority was starting to crack. But the situation wasn't entirely resolved. A week later, I found small signs of passive resistance. A piece of the dock had been slightly tampered with, nothing dangerous, just enough to signal that someone was testing the boundaries. I didn't panic. I documented it carefully, took photos, and made a note of the exact condition of the dock. This wasn't about retaliation, it was about protecting my property and reinforcing the fact that I wouldn't be intimidated. During this time, I also took the opportunity to strengthen relationships with neighbors. Casual conversations, shared laughs, and friendly gestures slowly built support. People started seeing me not as an outsider, but as someone who respected the community and was standing up for what was right. That support mattered more than any confrontation with the HOA. In small neighborhoods, social influence can often carry more weight than formal authority. Despite the calm on my side, I knew the HOA was planning a next move. I could sense it in their notices, in their subtle inquiries, in the way they lingered near the lake when they thought I wasn't looking. They were trying to regain control, to assert dominance without directly confronting the legal reality I had established. One day, a meeting invitation arrived. It was formal, written in a tone that tried to sound neutral, but the underlying message was clear. They wanted to discuss community standards regarding the lake and docks. I knew this was their attempt to save face and possibly find a way to undermine my authority. I prepared meticulously. I printed copies of all documents, reviewed local property laws, and anticipated every possible argument they could make. Unlike before, I wasn't just defending my dock, I was ready to assert my position, make clear the HOA's limits, and ensure that any future attempts at intimidation would fail. The day of the meeting, I arrived early. The tension in the room was palpable. They tried to maintain composure, but I could see the subtle signs. The way they avoided eye contact, the hesitant gestures, the careful wording of their questions. The dynamic had shifted completely. The power that had once been assumed by them was now in my hands. As the meeting progressed, I calmly presented the facts, documented the dock's legal status, and clarified the boundaries of HOA authority. Every question they asked, every challenge they made, was met with clear, concise answers. By the end of the session, it was obvious. They had no leverage, no way to challenge me without overstepping their legal bounds. Leaving the meeting, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Not because I had defeated the HOA in a dramatic showdown, but because I had established a lasting understanding of boundaries, respect, and authority. I had turned a potentially stressful, intimidating situation into one where I controlled the narrative and protected my home. That night, I walked down to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the setting sun, and I felt a deep sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, there could always be new challenges, but I had gained the upper hand in a way that was both satisfying and lasting. I realized something important during this period. Standing up for yourself isn't about confrontation for its own sake. It's about knowledge, preparation, and calm confidence. The HOA had stormed in, demanding authority, expecting compliance, and I had shown that with the right combination of these things, even a small homeowner can hold power. The aftermath was a mix of relief, pride, and cautious vigilance. I had successfully defended my property, exposed the limits of the HOA's power, and gained the respect, whether silently or openly, of my neighbors. But more than that, I had learned that sometimes, the quiet victories, the controlled responses, and the preparation behind the scenes are the ones that truly change the game. By the end of Part 4, I knew the HOA would be more careful around me. They might attempt subtle strategies, but they would never again assume I would back down without proof. The tables had turned, and I was now fully in control, not just of the docks, but of my own peace of mind. After weeks of tension, subtle confrontations, and careful documentation, the neighborhood finally seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The HOA had retreated from their initial aggression, no longer storming in or sending threatening notices. Their confident struts and clipped tones had faded, replaced with cautious politeness whenever they approached. I could sense that they were still watching, still testing, but the dynamic had shifted completely. For me, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. I spent my mornings on the lake, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight dance across the water. The dock, which had been the center of conflict, now felt like a symbol of not just property, but control, preparation, and quiet victory. I walked along it often, running my fingers across the wood, appreciating the peace that came with knowing I had stood my ground. Neighbors who had been curious, or maybe even wary, began to approach me with small smiles and casual conversations. One afternoon, an older couple from down the street came by with freshly baked cookies. "We heard about what happened with the HOA, they said. We just wanted to say, we admire how you handled everything. That could have been messy, but you kept it calm and firm." I smiled, feeling both relief and pride. It wasn't about showing off, but about maintaining dignity while protecting my home. Their support, even small gestures like this, made a difference. In a neighborhood like this, influence isn't always about authority, it's about respect. And slowly, I felt that respect growing. The HOA did attempt one last minor challenge, sending a formal letter questioning a small detail about dock maintenance. I responded promptly, professionally, and clearly outlined my compliance with all local regulations. That was the final time they reached out with any sort of implied threat. After that, silence. And in that silence, I recognized victory. The emotional weight of the experience gradually lifted. At first, I had felt anxiety, fear, and a sense of violation. My home, a place that was supposed to feel safe, had become a battlefield. But standing firm, calmly presenting facts, and maintaining composure transformed those emotions into confidence, pride, and a sense of accomplishment. I realized that true power doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from preparation, clarity, and knowing your rights. One evening, I sat on the dock as the sun set behind the trees. The water reflected the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the breeze was gentle, and the distant calls of birds filled the air. I took a deep breath and allowed myself to feel the full weight of the journey I had just endured. The fear, the frustration, the tension, it had all led to this moment of peace. I thought back to the first day, when the HOA had stormed in, confident and intimidating. They had believed that they could assert power over me, that I would be intimidated, that I would give up my rights without a fight. They had no idea I had spent months preparing, reviewing legal documents, and understanding the boundaries of authority. They underestimated me, and that underestimation had been their undoing. The experience also taught me about the nature of conflict and authority. People in positions of perceived power often overreach, assuming that others will comply without question. But when you understand your rights and act calmly and decisively, you can challenge assumptions without aggression. The dock had been my leverage, yes. But it was my preparation and composure that had made it effective. I also realized the importance of community. While the HOA had tried to assert control, my neighbors' quiet support had been invaluable. Casual conversations, small gestures, and shared respect created an environment where the HOA's attempts at intimidation lost impact. Influence isn't always about rules or authority, it's often about relationships, trust, and perception. Weeks turned into months, and life returned to a comfortable rhythm. The dock became a place of relaxation rather than tension. I spent weekends fishing, kayaking, or simply watching the sun rise over the water. The HOA existed in the background now, but without their previous swagger, without their attempts to dominate. They had learned, quietly, that I was not someone to be underestimated. Reflecting on the experience, I felt a mixture of pride and relief. Pride in having stood up for myself and for what was rightfully mine. Relief that the confrontation was over and that I had done so without escalating into something aggressive or destructive. The emotional payoff was satisfying precisely because it was earned, grounded in preparation, knowledge, and calm action. Most importantly, I learned that standing your ground doesn't always have to be loud or confrontational. Sometimes, it's about showing quiet strength, demonstrating understanding, and letting actions speak louder than threats. The HOA had stormed in expecting a reaction. I gave them one, but on my terms. And in doing so, I controlled not just the docks, but the outcome, the narrative, and my own peace of mind. Looking back, the lake house had offered more than a home. It had offered a test of patience, resilience, and strategy. It had shown me that when faced with intimidation, knowledge and preparation can turn the tide. And it had taught me that respect, earned through calm, informed, and confident action, is far more powerful than authority assumed by fear. On that final evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned back on the dock, closed my eyes, and listened to the gentle lapping of the water. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from triumph over others, but from triumph over uncertainty, fear, and doubt. The HOA had tried to intimidate me, to take what was mine. But in the end, it was my knowledge, my preparation, and my calm determination that prevailed. And in that quiet, golden light, I finally felt completely at home. After weeks of tension, subtle confrontations, and careful documentation, the neighborhood finally seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The HOA had retreated from their initial aggression, no longer storming in or sending threatening notices. Their confident struts and clipped tones had faded, replaced with cautious politeness whenever they approached. I could sense that they were still watching, still testing, but the dynamic had shifted completely. For me, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. I spent my mornings on the lake, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight dance across the water. The dock, which had been the center of conflict, now felt like a symbol of not just property, but control, preparation, and quiet victory. I walked along it often, running my fingers across the wood, appreciating the peace that came with knowing I had stood my ground. Neighbors who had been curious, or maybe even wary, began to approach me with small smiles and casual conversations. One afternoon, an older couple from down the street came by with freshly baked cookies. "We heard about what happened with the HOA," they said. "We just wanted to say, we admire how you handled everything. That could have been messy, but you kept it calm and firm." I smiled, feeling both relief and pride. It wasn't about showing off, but about maintaining dignity while protecting my home. Their support, even small gestures like this, made a difference. In a neighborhood like this, influence isn't always about authority, it's about respect. And slowly, I felt that respect growing. The HOA did attempt one last minor challenge, sending a formal letter questioning a small detail about dock maintenance. I responded promptly, professionally, and clearly outlined my compliance with all local regulations. That was the final time they reached out with any sort of implied threat. After that, silence. And in that silence, I recognized victory. The emotional weight of the experience gradually lifted. At first, I had felt anxiety, fear, and a sense of violation. My home, a place that was supposed to feel safe, had become a battlefield. But standing firm, calmly presenting facts, and maintaining composure transformed those emotions into confidence, pride, and a sense of accomplishment. I realized that true power doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from preparation, clarity, and knowing your rights. One evening, I sat on the dock as the sun set behind the trees. The water reflected the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the breeze was gentle, and the distant calls of birds filled the air. I took a deep breath and allowed myself to feel the full weight of the journey I had just endured. The fear, the frustration, the tension, it had all led to this moment of peace. I thought back to the first day, when the HOA had stormed in, confident and intimidating. They had believed that they could assert power over me, that I would be intimidated, that I would give up my rights without a fight. They had no idea I had spent months preparing, reviewing legal documents, and understanding the boundaries of authority. They underestimated me, and that underestimation had been their undoing. The experience also taught me about the nature of conflict and authority. People in positions of perceived power often overreach, assuming that others will comply without question. But when you understand your rights and act calmly and decisively, you can challenge assumptions without aggression. The dock had been my leverage, yes. But it was my preparation and composure that had made it effective. I also realized the importance of community. While the HOA had tried to assert control, my neighbors' quiet support had been invaluable. Casual conversations, small gestures, and shared respect created an environment where the HOA's attempts at intimidation lost impact. Influence isn't always about rules or authority, it's often about relationships, trust, and perception. Weeks turned into months, and life returned to a comfortable rhythm. The dock became a place of relaxation rather than tension. I spent weekends fishing, kayaking, or simply watching the sun rise over the water. The HOA existed in the background now, but without their previous swagger, without their attempts to dominate. They had learned, quietly, that I was not someone to be underestimated. Reflecting on the experience, I felt a mixture of pride and relief. Pride in having stood up for myself and for what was rightfully mine. Relief that the confrontation was over and that I had done so without escalating into something aggressive or destructive. The emotional payoff was satisfying precisely because it was earned, grounded in preparation, knowledge, and calm action. Most importantly, I learned that standing your ground doesn't always have to be loud or confrontational. Sometimes, it's about showing quiet strength, demonstrating understanding, and letting actions speak louder than threats. The HOA had stormed in expecting a reaction. I gave them one, but on my terms. And in doing so, I controlled not just the docs, but the outcome, the narrative, and my own peace of mind. Looking back, the lake house had offered more than a home. It had offered a test of patience, resilience, and strategy. It had shown me that when faced with intimidation, knowledge and preparation can turn the tide. And it had taught me that respect, earned through calm, informed, and confident action, is far more powerful than authority assumed by fear. On that final evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned back on the dock, closed my eyes, and listened to the gentle lapping of the water. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from triumph over others, but from triumph over uncertainty, fear, and doubt. The HOA had tried to intimidate me, to take what was mine. But in the end, it was my knowledge, my preparation, and my calm determination that prevailed. And in that quiet, golden light, I finally felt completely at home.